I want to take you back to June 12th, 1971. At 6 o'clock that evening, the presses began to roll. For weeks leading up to that moment, a team of reporters and editors from the New York Times had been holed up inside a block of hotel rooms just up the street here at the New York Hilton. They were secretly organizing and verifying nearly 7,000 pages of classified government documents that the United States government did not know yet that they had. Robert McNamara at the time was then President Lyndon Johnson's Secretary of Defense. By 1967, McNamara had developed some doubts about the war that he had helped build. So he commissioned a secret internal study to understand how the United States has gotten itself so deep into the Vietnam War. He didn't tell the Secretary of State about the study. He didn't tell the president. When it was finished, just 15 copies of what would become known as the Pentagon Papers existed. Each one was locked away. Now, one of the analysts with access to that study was a man named Daniel Ellsberg. He worked at the Rand Corporation, a Defense Department contractor. He had spent years as a Vietnam analyst. He had believed in the war. He had gone there himself, walked the villages, watched soldiers die. And reading that study changed him. Ellsberg became certain of two things. The war was unwinnable, and the U.S. government knew it was unwinnable. So at night, over the course of months, Ellsberg would sneak pages out of the Rand safe and copy them, one sheet at a time on a Xerox machine. And then he handed those pages to a reporter. On June 13th, 1971, the New York Times published the first of its reports. The Nixon administration went to court the very next day. For 15 days, a federal court order prevented the Times from publishing any more on the Pentagon Papers. But Ellsberg himself didn't stop. He passed another copy of the Pentagon Papers to the Washington Post's national editor. So the Washington Post began publishing the papers on June 18th. And the government went back to court and tried to stop them, too. So now, two of the biggest newspapers in America were fighting the United States government over the very same set of documents, leaked documents. The case made it to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. 12 days later, June 30th, 1971, the court ruled 6-3 that the U.S. government had not met the bar required to suppress the publication of these documents. The press had the right to publish the Pentagon Papers. In his concurring opinion, Justice Hugo Black described the essential role that the framers always intended a free press to play in democracy. Quote, the press was to serve the governed, not the governors. Only a free and unrestrained press can effectively expose deception in government. And paramount among the responsibilities of a free press is the duty to prevent any part of the government from deceiving the people and sending them off to distant lands to die of foreign fevers and foreign shot and shell. In my view, far from deserving condemnation for their courageous reporting, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other newspapers should be commended for serving the purpose that the Founding Fathers saw so clearly. In revealing the workings of government that led to the Vietnam War, the newspapers nobly did precisely that which the Founders hoped and trusted they would do. End quote. The deception that Justice Black was referring to in this instance was this. The Johnson administration had systematically lied not only to the public, but to Congress about the scope and the trajectory of the Vietnam War. Secret raids on North Vietnam, Marine Corps attacks that never appeared in the press, an American military footprint expanding far beyond what the public had been told. The American people had been kept deliberately in the dark about a war that was being waged in their name. They learned the truth because one man decided they had the right to know. None of that happens without a leak. Fast forward to January 2004. A U.S. Army Reserve specialist named Joseph Darby is stationed at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Darby didn't set out to blow any whistles. He stumbled onto what was happening by accident. He asked a fellow soldier, Corporal Charles Grainer, for scenic photographs of the Iraqi countryside that he could send home to his family. What he found instead on the CD of photos he was given were images of American military personnel humiliating, torturing, and sexually abusing Iraqi detainees, naked prisoners stacked in human pyramids, men hooded and wired to electrodes, a young soldier holding a leash that was attached to a man's neck. It took Darby 3 weeks to decide what to do with this information. He was promised anonymity. He was, after all, a soldier living among the very people against whom he would be called upon to testify. The story found its way to CBS. Producers traveled to Kuwait. They talked to a dozen sources. They confirmed the photographs. As they prepared to broadcast, the Pentagon called CBS and asked them to delay. Don't jeopardize American operations, they said. Don't endanger the lives of soldiers and hostages. CBS waited 2 weeks and then aired the story in April of 2004. Congressional hearings soon followed. A Pentagon review described what happened at Abu Ghraib as sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. And then the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, testifying before Congress, burned Darby's anonymity. He thanked him by name on live television. Within hours, everybody in his unit knew. Darby was sitting eating lunch at the time in a crowded mess hall in Iraq, watching the hearings along with some 400 of his fellow troops. He was never able to go back to the life he had before, but the American public learned what was being done in their name in that prison thanks to Joseph Darby. None of that happens without a leak. Let's go back further. June 17th, 1972, 5 burglars are arrested inside the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate complex in Washington. The story lands on 2 relatively unknown reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. What those reporters don't know yet is that the number 2 official at the FBI, the associate director, a man named W. Mark Felt, knows exactly what the White House is up to. It is pressuring his bureau to shut down its own Watergate investigation. Frustrated by the obstruction and believing the White House was undermining the FBI's independence, Felt began leaking to journalists in secret. 6 times between October 1972 and November 1973, Felt met Woodward in a parking garage in Rosslyn, Virginia, parking space D32. He chose that spot because of its proximity to the stairwell, meant that they could hear anyone who was coming. In fact, they communicated by signals. A flower pot with a red flag on Woodward's balcony meant one thing, meant meet tonight. Mark Felt risked everything because he believed a president was using the power of the federal government to cover up crimes against democracy itself. He kept that secret, by the way, for 33 years. He finally revealed himself in 2005 at the age of 91. His leads helped Woodward and Bernstein connect the Watergate break-in to high-level White House officials, exposing illegal wiretapping, political sabotage, and a pattern of obstruction that reached directly into the Oval Office. It led to Senate hearings in 1973 and led directly to Nixon's resignation on August 9, 1974. A president of the United States was held accountable for crimes against democracy. None of that happens without a leak. Which brings us to this week. On Monday, President Trump stood at the White House and he threatened to jail the journalist behind reporting that a second airman was missing in Iran after an F-15 was shot down. His exact words, quote, "We're going to go to the media company that released it. We're going to say national security, give it up or go to jail," end quote. Now, the premise of that threat is absurd. The crash was not a secret. Iranian forces knew they had shot down an American jet, and the fact that a 2-seater fighter aircraft carried 2 crew members was not classified intelligence. It was basic arithmetic. An F-15 carries a pilot and a weapons systems officer. You do not need a security clearance to know that. The hypocrisy of this is hard to ignore because while threatening to jail reporters for revealing sensitive information, Trump himself voluntarily disclosed that 155 aircraft, including bombers, fighter jets, and refueling tankers, were involved in the rescue mission. The same president who calls journalists traitors for reporting what he doesn't want to be known openly broadcasts operational details when it suits him. By the way, this is not the first time that Trump threatened journalists over his war of choice in Iran. In March, he posted a lengthy tirade to Truth Social, threatening to charge media outlets with treason over their war coverage. The FCC chair, Brendan Carr, piled on, threatening to revoke broadcasters' licenses over their coverage of the war. But these threats against a free press go far beyond the war in Iran. They're part of a sustained, methodical campaign. In September, there's a new policy that still restricted outing under government escort. Judge Friedman called it a blatant attempt to circumvent a lawful order. This past Thursday, April 9th, he ruled again. The Defense Department, he wrote, was attempting to control the message so that the public hears and sees only what the Secretary of Defense and the Trump administration want the public to hear and see. Quote, he closed with this, quote, the Constitution demands better. The American public demands better, too. The Pentagon, by the way, says it will appeal. It's in the process of appealing. But here's what you need to understand about all of this. Taken together, Daniel Ellsberg faced 115 years in prison for telling Americans that their government had lied to them about Vietnam for a decade. Joseph Darby was never able to go back to the life he had before for telling the Army what its soldiers were doing to prisoners in American custody. Mark Felt risked everything and kept that secret for 33 years because he believed a president was using the power of the federal government to cover up crimes against democracy itself. In each case, the government called it a threat to national security. In each case, history judged otherwise. What this administration is building through credential revocations, through courtroom defiance, through the threat of prison for reporters who receive information from sources inside the government is a system in which the next Abu Ghraib stays buried, in which the next Deep Throat never makes the call, in which the war of choice being waged in our names is built on a narrative that no one is allowed to question. That is not national security. That is a government trying to hide the truth of a war whose folly is becoming harder and harder to conceal by the day. Responding to the president's threats, Seth Stern of the Freedom of the Press Foundation put it plainly, quote, journalists don't work for the government, and their right to publish government leaks is protected by the First Amendment, which, despite Trump's efforts, remains the law of the land. It does not disappear whenever the words national security are uttered. Some of the most important news stories in American history have come from confidential sources, including stories that have brought down corrupt presidents. That's why Trump is so obsessed with leaks. It has nothing to do with national security, end quote.